When value is transferred from the future to the past and represented numerically, we refer to this as debt. And in a lot of ways, we could choose to describe this as a subsidy. So what this means is the future is subsidizing the present. We can form a similar relationship between competency and consumption. And really, this relationship can go wrong in either direction if taken to the extreme. If competency is rewarded too much, you can imagine it as Olympic gold medalists being the only ones who can afford a meal. No matter how much you convince the average person to try and win that medal, a large percentage of the society is simply not going to be competitive with certain genetics. This does not in any way describe the current state of affairs or the choices that our nation has made leading up to this point. In terms of savings and debt, that would represent far too much savings. And I think we all know that's not the current situation. As we drown in debt, it could be much better to think of the choices we made as a group to subsidize consumption by synthesizing competency. We should think of the Civil Rights Act as the origin of intersectional feminism and the beginning of fiat competency. Now, at this point in time, we still had savings. We were on the Bretton Woods system, and the gold window was still open. However, this was much like a drug addict who began a new habit, had lots of money in the bank, and long lines of credit. Because by codifying in law what we now call intersectional feminism through the Civil Rights Act, by saying any discrepancy among races will no longer ever be attributed to competency. Instead, it's a form of discrimination, which means that someone with immutable traits doesn't need to be competent in order to be a statistic that creates equality. And so when I talk about transferring value from the future to the present, this was really the death of competency hierarchies, because once you start subsidizing people who lack competency based on immutable traits, they now exist in the hierarchy at all levels. And so someone who is at the top level and incompetent, their behavior is going to be emulated by the people beneath them who are competent, because we were not honest about what we did. So the suggestion was that this person that's a DEI hire was not hired because of immutable characteristics, but quote unquote competency or trans competency. It is easy to see the relationship to debt or subsidized consumption by recognizing that shortly after, in the 1970s, Nixon was forced to close the gold window. In an ecosystem, to use biological scientific terms, we would most likely use the term homeostasis. When we think of human beings in terms of ecology and things like homeostasis, it's important to understand the concept of poaching. For example, commercialized fishing represents not necessarily poaching, but the ability to exceed homeostasis and capture all fish until that population no longer exists. There is an argument to be made if the wealthy control all of the lakes and refuse to let the poor fish, not out of ecological terms, but out of greed and out of control. However, that is not the situation being described. Instead, a tragedy of the commons is occurring where each individual DEI hire benefits for themselves by being injected into the competency hierarchy and earning more income than they otherwise would. Unfortunately, the downside of not being competent means a lack of skill in solving a problem. And so in that sense, we have codified into law the requirement to poach private enterprise until it fully collapses that population. A good example of this lack of ability to solve problems is something we previously used to talk about in politics. That concept is called tort reform, and this has to do with how civil lawsuits work. So a private enterprise could be competent, could be doing what it's supposed to do, or it could be malicious. And if it's acting malicious, the way we solve that is not typically with criminal penalties, but with civil penalties, meaning a financial lawsuit. While America was still in a highly functional state, people quickly began to realize that lawsuits were creating undue pressure onto businesses that were causing them to collapse. This became the talking point du jour amongst politicians, particularly on the right. Unfortunately, most politicians come from a legal background, and the legal population, which may be concentrated in a certain race, was unable or unwilling to resolve the concept known as tort reform. Rather than continuing to have a political pressure applied by the general population in terms of resolving tort reform, people eventually simply gave up on the concept. This could be a rational form of thinking if the idea is that there is an upstream problem that needs to be resolved before something like tort reform can be addressed. The most logical dependency is to recognize that prior to intersectional feminism, we needed first wave feminism, which was granting access for women to vote who did nothing to earn or accomplish this status. So the act of giving women the vote was not something earned, but was itself subsidized consumption via artificial competency. The means of creating that subsidy came from the creation of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. This was undoubtedly the death of meritocracy. When you replace competency with social status in terms of hierarchy, what you do is replace masculine capitalism with feminine socialism. It is a shift from the individual to the group. Understanding the relationship between tort reform and the Federal Reserve is a highly abstract concept that is beyond the reach of most voters. Given that logic, it should be unsurprising that we are stuck in a loop where society can no longer solve any meaningful problems where there is a financial incentive for a select group of people to keep the problem in place. Given the highly consolidated nature of social media, there is far too much incentive to create censorship as a means of ensuring those problems do not get resolved by the people who profit from the problems continuing to exist. We need to stop subsidizing consumption via a means of poaching competency. Thank you very much and have a good day.